This call is now being recorded.
So, well, one thing before we started with your article, I saw their Impossible's video, a brief history.
Mm-hmm.
Did they create any videos for YouTube during the time you studied that directly addressed the issues, the two major issues that you mentioned can help with the user communities, like specifically about empathy or mythologizing?
Oh, you mean whether they created a specific video that during the time when I studied them?
Yeah.
Well, I guess our findings are based on sort of the entire set of actions, not on one specific video. So
okay,
there
and
wouldn't be.
I'm going to go through those too, your methodology. But I was just wondering, because I'm thinking of using that brief history, including that link in the summary, just to help readers learn about the organization. And I was wondering, if they directly used multimedia to do some of the things that you recommend from your findings.
Oh, that's what you're saying. Oh, yeah, I understand. Yes, that video is a good example actually. Where
okay.
if you that video is actually a good example, right? Because they show the challenges, they build empathy, and they idealize their own actions. So in some ways, that's a good example of some of the actions that they do in order to connect with their community.
Got it. Okay, that's a good explanation. I was just wondering if they were a little less subtle, like, for example, getting videos of people from the user communities to talk about both of these things, to kind of bring others along with them.
Ah, I see. I don't think they directly did that. I don't think there were specific examples of where they would get someone from the community to point out how difficult it is. Some of that obviously happened, but it was more, say, on Twitter, but it was more organic. It didn't seem to be that they would then sort of capitalize on that and retweet or turn it into a video or something like that. I think it was a bit more subtle than that. Yeah.
Would that kind of approach be effective, do you think? Less subtle, directly addressing those issues and involving the user community members?
Well, this is pure speculation.
Right.
So I'm not sure. We did see that obviously they did get people. They did get support from people, but of course, has there been a powerful endorsement from someone that would probably have been very effective, but that didn't seem to systematically occur so yeah.
Okay. I might as well check the numbers. I want to check some of the numbers in the methodology. I'll just be going into this briefly, but so you did 75 interviews, 35 with Impossible staff, and 5 with Impossible retailers, and 34 were user community members. Are those numbers correct?
So yeah, I'm just looking at the paper. So 40 interviews with staff and retailers, and 34 with community members is what I see in the summary, the table 1 summary. So that would be 74 interviews all together.
Okay, and some of the other numbers: 650 newsletters, 131 blog entries out of 1,200. 90 press releases, 388 minutes of film, and 1,550 tweets.
I have 1,570 here on table 1 of data structure. But yes, I think 50 tweets. All the other numbers were accurate.
Let me check that. Double check that. I'm
Yeah,
looking.
so it's
Okay.
74
I have.
interviews.
Could you look at page 14 of 65
Sure.
on the PDF?
Yeah.
Okay, I see. We collected.
Oh, you're right.
15.
There is a discrepancy. You're right. It says 1550 on that page and 1570 in the back. So let's be conservative and say 1550.
Although it does say over 1550, and maybe you were rounding down. I just want to make sure that it doesn't contradict. What number would you like to say?
Well, why don't we say over 1550, given that that's consistent with.
God, I'll keep it there. I'll keep it
Yeah.
there. Let's see. So I want to read one part of it. Following this radical change of direction, the identification of key stakeholders is threatened. This is, I'm reading from your paper. This leads stakeholders to challenge the venture either by attacking it outright if they feel betrayed by the new focus, or doubting it if they feel anxious about the new focus. So specifically, in this kind of context, how can attackers hurt a venture?
Mm-hmm. So the challenge that a new venture faces in this situation is that attackers are people who feel betrayed by the venture, and as such, they have a lot of, energy often to fight back. They do so in a number of ways. So one, obviously, particularly damaging choice if they go into social media to outright share their discontent with the venture. So that's one common one. Another one is, of course, to stop purchasing film. Another one is to engage in sort of word of mouth, sort of a diatribe, and to their network. So there are a range of options of how attackers can hurt these ventures when they diverge from what these community members or what these attackers had expected.
And I think you mentioned they even go beyond not buying the film. They can organize boycotts.
That's exactly right. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So that can be a particularly extreme consequence of that, because as a new venture, what you're facing then is that both sort of your reputational currency is devalued or tainted, and also your sales. So I guess both maybe to put it in simple terms, what you might face is that both your reputation and your sales nosedive. So take a beating. So yeah. So I guess maybe I don't know if that's helpful, but maybe a sort of simple way or sort of catchy way of putting it is that both your simultaneously your reputation and your sales take a big hit.
That's a good way to put it. And tell me how doubters can hurt such a venture.
Yeah, so doubters they differ from attackers because they didn't feel betrayed as such. They're just really confused. They're just really concerned about what's happening. So they're also problematic, obviously, because they stop buying the film and start questioning the venture. But they are less, I guess, lethal compared to attackers who can really destroy the venture's reputation and spread discontent through their reputational actions, thus jeopardizing the venture's survival.
Okay, so the doubters are, potential lawyer customers or stakeholders that the venture could have had but doesn't have. They're not actively doing something to hurt the organization. Is that the difference?
So it's fairly close. Yeah. So the main issue is that sort of doubters will continue to engage in a dialogue with the venture. They haven't given up on the venture. They're still confused and discontent, unhappy, but fundamentally they're it's a more mellow version. They might engage in sort of, they're more passive, I guess, in that they stop buying, they start asking questions about why have you changed, but they won't necessarily, they won't mount the barricades, they won't organize a boycott. They are less extreme than attackers. Because, I mean, I guess one key difference is that attackers are kind of done with the venture, while doubters still have hope that they can come back, or that they can make it work. I mean, that is one issue, and we find in fact that many doubters do come back, and if the venture plays its cards right. So doubters, you can still win doubters back.
Got it. Can you give me some examples in the identification reset work? Give me some examples that ventures can seek empathy, ways they can do that, and expose the struggles.
Yes, I mean, so I guess maybe Michael, just maybe if you allow me to make on this point sort of a broader observation, which might or might not be helpful for the piece. Usually, new ventures. Specifically to that point, usually new ventures do everything to avoid their struggles. So usually new ventures only want to show their successes rather than their struggles. So they want to show how much they've been growing, how great their technology is, how much their customers love them, in order obviously to raise money, to drum up more support. And so what we find is which is probably a pretty sort of tough pill to swallow for many ventures, is that actually ventures may not always benefit from touting their successes, but sometimes they may have to show their failures. So rather than showing and extolling their strengths, they may have to really expose their weaknesses. So why is that the case? The reason for that is that this is how you can placate attackers, or how you can placate those who feel betrayed by the venture. So these are people who have invested a lot emotionally and possibly financially into the venture, and they suddenly feel betrayed. And so how can you make sure that you diffuse, I guess, this time bomb or this threat that arises from attackers who essentially want to take a form of, in its most extreme form, a form of revenge on the venture. So what you can do is, just as you said, seek empathy for venture challenges. And so, specific examples we find is exposing a specific setback that the venture has had with its technology. So, for example, in our case, it would have been showing that a key step of film development did not work out, or that a key type of material that the venture needs, raw material, is no longer available. It might involve also on the financial side, exposing financial struggles and showing how much the venture has been suffering. So I think that, the two key ways of seeking, or two key, maybe not the two key ways, but two key ways are exposing financial difficulties or highlighting technical challenges that are really hurting the venture.
Right, and it's obvious why that could be something that the venture might not lean toward just reaction as a simple reaction exposing, because you can see how that could say the organization was trying to raise venture capital at the same time.
Absolutely. Usually you try to avoid like the plague, right? You try to avoid exposing as a new venture. You try to avoid exposing any weaknesses or problems, just because, as you said, this might impede the opportunity to raise funding. This might shake confidence among potential suppliers or current partners and potential customers, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a variety of risks in exposing your weaknesses or in exposing difficulties. The reason why we find that this works in this case is because, I guess, the challenge the challenge that the venture has on its hands is quite such a fundamental one that you have to imagine you're in a situation where your original strategy has failed. So you are in a situation where you need to radically pivot in order to make a new strategy work. But in order to survive the time of the pivot, you're still depending on your old community, your original community. Yeah. So if they now ruin your reputation and decimate your sales, then you will not be able to pull off the pivot. You won't have the sales and the customer interest and support in order to pivot to the new approach. Because who would want, if you think about attackers constantly saying how terrible the organization, how terrible the venture is, and stopping and encouraging everyone to stop buying your product. I mean, that can be a mortal blow for the venture. Right. So that's why in this case, this very surprising approach has proven effective. That you really, given that you're facing this sort of life-threatening situation, often you expose your weaknesses in order to overcome this crisis of publicity and of trust, or I guess trust is the wrong word, but this crisis with one of your key stakeholder groups.
I see. So it's an act of desperation that a venture might not think that you could ever even try, but in this case, that desperate act is actually the solution, part of the solution.
Yeah. I would be cautious probably about calling it an act of desperation, although it would be a great soundbite.
Well, I only meant that in that you're saying they're at the point where they can't survive with their previous model.
Yeah. So yeah, the stakes are very high, and right. And yes, you as you say I guess maybe sort of a way of putting it is that usually the preferred strategy is to tout your strengths, but given that this is not an option in this situation, and as you said, the venture's existence is on the line, you engage in the opposite strategy of exposing your weaknesses in order to rebuild relationships with key stakeholders and in order to ensure the survival of the venture.
Tell me also, Christian, please, some examples of mythologizing, ways that a venture can mythologize its technology and commitment.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, maybe just to briefly back out, the challenge you're facing here is that a key part of a key group of stakeholders has lost faith in you, is anxious about where you're going. So the key sort of objective of mythologizing is to rebuilding that relationship and to dispelling concerns about the venture and its genuineness and its commitment to what it is doing. And so mythologizing addresses this anxiety by stakeholders head on by showing that the venture is 100% committed to what it sets out to do and 100% committed to its technology and to its product. So examples of mythologizing are that you celebrate really the venture's sacrifices, its achievements, its sort of heritage and a devotion to the product, to the history of what's happening here, and also how it is making actual progress in tackling some of the problems. And finally, we also show that it's helpful to invoke members of the community who support effectively the venture. So one example, maybe to give one very specific examples. So one of the fears was that this company, because it was pivoting, that it was moving away from its core technology, analog technology. So the venture really moved sort of proactively or moved decisively is the word, decisively. The venture moved decisively to say how enamored everyone on the team is with Polaroid technology, with how much they respect and adore the inventor of Polaroid, Edwin Land. So all these steps to dispel this concern that that threatens their relationship with
to
key
tell the
stakeholders.
users that we love this as much as you do.
That's exactly it. That's a great way of putting it. Absolutely.
I see. And almost making
That's exactly
feel like, and almost making the users feel like we are you. We're all on the same page here. That's what it sounds
Oh,
like.
you know what? That's so interesting. You know what? That is so interesting. Actually, in some ways, it's slightly different because they say, you know what? In some ways, this is a great sort of one-liner to explain what you have to do. So the venture says, we love this as much as you do, but we are different from you. And in fact, that is the key difference between the first phase and the second phase, because the reason all these problems arise, or a big reason why a lot of these problems arise, is because the community members or the stakeholders, they thought that the venture is like a friend to them, that they're all sort of the same, that they're not just on the same team, but that they are the same, as it were. So that they're not just fighting for the same cause, analog technology, but that they're friends or buddies, that effectively the venture is like another person. And that created an excessive closeness and an excessive set of expectations that the venture was unable to fulfill, because obviously at the end of the day it is a company that needs to make profits to survive. It cannot act like a friend or another community member. So that's why it needed to pull back from the original, we love this as much as you do, and we are you, to we love this as much as you do, but we are not without being you. Or we can love this as much as you do without being you.
Got it. Okay.
Does that make sense?
I guess that's yes, it does, and that's a good explanation, and it's related to it. I'm reading from your paper again. Impossible's user community reacted so strongly to change of direction because community members anthropomorphized the venture.
That's exactly it. Exactly.
So, is that something that that element too that the venture should keep in mind when they craft their empathy-seeking methods and their mythologizing methods? That they also need to be aware of not just anthropomorphization, but what kind of persona they're creating when they do that.
Exactly, yes. So it turns out that it is very, very risky to engage in anthropomorphization, because you create this incredible closeness, which usually is very positive, but you create very high expectations that may set you up for failure in your relationship with stakeholders, because the moment these stakeholders think that you are like them, and in fact, in some ways that they have some level of ownership or some level of right to you and to what you do. So there is a real risk that if you engage in anthropomorphization and if you set up these very high expectations, that you will disappoint this stakeholder group in the future, when I guess most ventures have to pivot. So when you have to pivot, when you have to change, you inevitably, given that you have created such high expectations, you then effectively set yourself up for failure, or risk setting yourself up for failure and for disappointing them. So during this phase of engaging in identity reset work, it is very important to engage in to rebuild trust without anthropomorphizing yourself, without creating the illusion that among people that you are and like their friend effectively, given that
Right.
you won't be able to meet those expectations, and especially given that you have disappointed them already based on this belief in the past.
The boundaries have to be clear and remain, and you play up with what can be shared effectively.
Exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. So you can share a lot of things, but like the love for the technology, but you can't share the illusion that you're another community member unless you are able to persist with this strategy and this approach consistently. And let's face it, which venture doesn't have to change and doesn't have to evolve?
Right. You were clear, how a pivot differs from, a strategy change. You mentioned how Flickr, for example, was a tool in an online role-playing game, how it started, and it applies to new ventures and drastic change. And you're also very clear how that change can the range of that from, an idea in I'm reading from this, an idea in the entrepreneur's head. Many others pivot at a later stage when they have pursued their initial approach for months or even years and attracted a base of loyal stakeholders. So my question there is, when is an organization no longer a new venture?
Ooh, okay, that's a very tricky one to answer, to be honest. I mean, there are different views in the literature.
I wasn't asking for that one, but I was asking for one that matches your definition of a new venture, but a new venture pivot.
Yeah. So fundamentally these are ventures are organizations that are in the early years of existence. So usually, an established organization would be highly formalized. So you have very clear hierarchy, lines of authority. You have the level of, obviously, bureaucracy, et cetera. Usually this means that there's a very established chain of command, et cetera. Well, in new ventures, everything is less static. It's more fluid. Often people have multiple roles. So I guess that is really where the distinction I think comes in for a lot of that. But there is not a hard and fast rule, I'm afraid.
And that's a good explanation, because I've been at small startups and big organizations and startups that grew. It's hard to tell when it is no longer a venture, though, even when you're there. Although after you, I was going to say, after you pass a certain point, it might be clear when you have an HR department and people no longer sleep under their desks and things like that.
Exactly. So I like this sort of opposition between a small startup and an established or like a new startup and an established organization, or something like that. I mean, we are essentially talking about startups, about organizations in their early years of existence. Maybe, I guess, if the term new venture is not helpful for communicating this, it's completely fine to use the term startup.
Okay, good. That's that's helpful too.
Okay.
So I saw, and I was really surprised. So, and this sounds like the best way to gather some of the information. You worked there for 8 weeks, but long weeks, so 350 hours. Can you tell me about? So I'll read this part. A key insight that emerged was the often hostile opposition that members of the the user community exhibited toward the pivot, and the challenges that the venture faced as a result. So you were there. What was like the feeling at Impossible during this time?
Yes, well, when news came in of tensions felt by the stakeholder community, the the concern was very visceral. People were very obviously negatively affected by this. Were unhappy that this was happening, because everyone felt this pivot was necessary, and everyone also people hadn't expected quite such a strong reaction. So there was an element of surprise. There was an element of disappointment. There was an element of concern for what was happening. So yes, it was a difficult. There were some difficult moments and some soul searching.
That's interesting.
Although, you know what, I don't know how much how help. You know what? It would be best, I think, not to talk about the time at Impossible. I don't think people would appreciate that element.
Okay.
Which isn't really in the paper either. So you know what? I think it's a nice idea of including atmospherics, but I think actually in this case, it probably would get me into trouble.
Like you were a spy.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't want to create that.
Okay. Well, I am going to mention. I understand. No problem. I am going to mention though that you were what the paper says. You were an unpaid intern there.
Oh no, feel free. Of course, anything that's in the paper, please feel free to use.
Got it. Okay.
I guess, just on reflection, I realized obviously I don't want to create trouble.
No problem. Although if I had to guess, I would imagine that what you just said actually understated the feelings that were happening there. You know, based on what the attackers were doing. I'm thinking just that kind of reaction can even hurt with staffing. People are like, I can't work in with this kind of hostility. That I'm really it's really surprising about that. Well, I'm cognizant of our time, Christian. I have one last question. You're giving an elevator speech to a manager or business leader. What would you say is the key takeaway or takeaways from your article?
Yeah. So I think, a few things. So first, pivoting is seen as a silver bullet for new ventures. But our article our study finds that it can be a double-edged sword, or that it can backfire. Rather than being the sort of surefire salvation in times of trouble, actually pivoting can create a whole new set of survival-threatening trouble. And so one key takeaway is to manage stakeholders very, very carefully during pivots in order to avoid, putting out one fire but creating another one in the process. So that's one key takeaway. The second key takeaway is that usually new ventures or usually startups think that they need to present themselves from their best side, but actually when it comes to rebuilding relationships with disappointed and seemingly betrayed, or stakeholders who feel betrayed, it may be worth presenting yourself. It may be worth exposing your worst side. So rather than showing your strengths, exposing your weaknesses in order to rebuild relationships, and in order to show that your genuineness, the genuineness of the venture. I think a lot of ventures get into trouble when their claims about their mission do no longer hold when financial reality hits, and that's why it's particularly important to show genuineness and to expose these problems in order to show this genuineness, in order to rebuild relationships. So I think these are some of the key takeaways. So pivoting is not a cost-free option, but can actually incur significant costs for new ventures. And when repairing relationships with disappointed stakeholders, exposing struggles rather than counting successes or strengths is a promising approach, or is an approach that can help to solve to put out fires or to solve a crisis.
Got it. That's good, Christian. Thank you. I don't have any other questions. Do you have any questions for me?
Well, actually, you know what? I realize this is the first interview I've ever given, so thank you very much, Michael.
Well, thank you for your time, Christian, and your thoughtful responses.
That's great. So yeah, I think was there? I mean, do you think there is useful stuff in there for writing the piece?
Oh, for sure. And I think even so the target audience is primarily managers and business leaders. That said,
Yeah.
I think you could tell looking through insights, even people who aspire to that or even supervise people find value in the content there. So even if those readers are not at a startup or whatever will be, I think it's an interesting story to tell. The case study approach and your findings, I just think are just simply very interesting. But yeah, I do think there are valuable takeaways for startups in it as well.
Great, yeah, because I know that the audience is not necessarily, I guess, founders of startups. So I just hope that there will be enough there for the insights audience as well. But yeah, as you say,
I do. Yeah, it's not a fully startup audience. I mean, we do have a topic called entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
But I think more than just entrepreneurs, anyone who's who's either worked at a startup or is interested in them would find this as an interesting story.
Okay, that's good. I guess maybe one sort of broad takeaway is this idea of authenticity, and that sort of exposing fears or weaknesses can help with authenticity. But yeah, no, I think, to be honest, I think it's primarily, I think the takeaway is, around pivoting and how you manage the fallout from them. I think that's really the main issue.
Yeah, and I think although what applies to being, you mentioned authenticity, authentic with deeply invested user communities might go beyond just being at a pivot point. It could be when a company makes changes that aren't just well received.
That's right, absolutely. And then when you face these cynical audiences who want to give up on the organization, how do you manage that? Yeah, that's a good point. That goes.
Yeah, just telling them exactly why the changes are being made, and reinforcing the values that have always been there. I think, So in that case, it's broader.
Okay, great.
All right. Well, thanks again, Christian, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. I also appreciate your detailed preparation for this and the great questions you asked. And I look forward to receiving the piece and to sending back the final version.
Great, and I'll get that to you in a couple of weeks.
Sure. No, I'll suit you. Sounds good.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All right. Take care.
Thank you. You too. Bye, Michael.